Welcome back to Weekly 340B News. Things have been pretty wild lately in the 340B world.
Yeah, no kidding.
And today we're going to really dive into all that.
I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
And thanks to Aventi Health for making this deep dive possible. Their customer-first approach to 340B third-party administration is really shaking things up.
From courtrooms to Congress to state legislatures, there's action everywhere you look.
Absolutely.
So let's start with one of the most talked about things right now. Big Pharma and their interesting new strategy when it comes to 340B
Rebate models.
rebate models. Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of giving covered entities that upfront discount, they want them to buy the drugs at full price. And then, you know, submit claims to get a rebate later.
That just seems like a huge headache for safety net providers. I mean, talk about a cash flow nightmare.
It's a nightmare. Imagine having to pay full price for these expensive drugs.
Yes.
And then who knows if you'll actually get that rebate. Exactly. Thankfully. HRSA, or as we all know it, HRSA, has come out pretty strong and said these rebate models violate the 340B statute.
They've really put their foot down. But of course, Big Pharma isn't backing down that easily.
Oh, of course not.
Several manufacturers, including Johnson & Johnson and Eli Lilly, are now suing HRSA.
They're really trying to challenge how HRSA is interpreting the 340B statute.
Yeah.
And Johnson & Johnson, they already tried this rebate thing once, and the feds shut it down.
Right.
Now they're coming back with a lawsuit. It's a big deal.
Huge. What happens with this case could change everything about how 340B works.
And it could have a massive impact on the bottom line for covered entities.
For sure.
Okay, so we've got these rebate battles going on. But let's move on to another issue that never seems to go away.
Contract pharmacies.
Contract pharmacies. It feels like we've been talking about this forever.
Yeah, it's been going on for years now.
So many manufacturers are still restricting 340B pricing on drugs dispensed at contract pharmacies.
Yeah. Even though HRSA has been pushing back.
And advocating for patients who really need those contract pharmacies.
Especially in rural areas, it's a matter of access.
It is. But the courts have mostly been siding with the manufacturers.
So far.
So far.
Yeah.
Which is a real blow to patients who rely on these contract pharmacies for affordable meds.
Absolutely.
And to make matters worse, some manufacturers, like Novo Nordisk,
Yeah.
have actually tightened their restrictions recently.
Yeah. They're making it even harder for patients to get the medications they need.
But there is some hope, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's that case in the Seventh Circuit,
Right. That's a big one.
a big one.
If the Seventh Circuit rules against the manufacturers, and that would go against previous rulings, we could see a circuit split.
Explain what you mean by a circuit split.
So basically, you'd have different federal courts making different decisions on the same issue,
Oh, I see.
and that could push the whole debate up to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so that's high stakes.
Very high stakes.
All right, so we've got all this action at the federal level. But what's happening in the states? Are states stepping up to protect 340B?
Well, while things are kind of stalled in Congress, there's been a lot happening in state legislatures.
And it sounds like it's a mixed bag.
Definitely a mix of good and bad news.
Well, let's start with the good news. What are some of the positive things happening at the state level?
Well, 8 states have actually passed laws protecting contract pharmacy access for 340B providers, and these laws have held up in court.
That's great to hear. Any big legal victories we should know about?
Arkansas is a great example.
Arkansas.
Their contract pharmacy law was challenged all the way to the Supreme Court,
Wow, all the way to the Supreme Court.
and the court actually declined to hear the case.
So that's a huge win for covered entities.
It is. It shows that these state-level protections can really work.
It seems like states are realizing they can't wait for the federal government to act, and they're taking matters into their own hands.
They're stepping up to protect 340B. But like I said, it's not all good news.
All right, what's the bad news?
There's a growing push in some states for more transparency around how covered entities use 340B savings.
Transparency. That doesn't sound so bad.
Well, the concern is that it could be done in a way that's misleading.
Misleading how?
Well, take Minnesota, for example. They recently released their first transparency report,
Okay.
and it caused a lot of controversy because it didn't really give the full picture of how those savings are being used.
So it was transparency for the sake of transparency.
Exactly, and that could set a bad precedent.
Other states might try to do the same thing.
And then covered entities end up with all these new reporting requirements that don't really benefit anyone.
Okay, so transparency is important,
Oui.
but it has to be done right.
Right.
So besides that, are there any other notable things happening in the states?
Oh, absolutely. On a positive note, over half the states now have laws preventing pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, and
Huh.
insurers from discriminating against 340B pharmacies.
That's a big deal. How do those laws work?
Well, they basically make sure that 340B pharmacies get fair reimbursement for medications, and that PBMs and insurers can't block them from participating in their networks.
So it's all about leveling the playing field.
Exactly. And it directly improves access to affordable meds for patients.
That's fantastic. Are there any states leading the charge on this?
Yeah, Missouri and Delaware just joined the fight. They both recently implemented these PBM and insurer anti-discrimination laws.
It sounds like the momentum is building.
It is. More and more states are recognizing the importance of protecting 340B pharmacies.
Okay, so we've covered rebates, contract pharmacy battles, and all the action happening in the states. But let's shift gears now and talk about what's happening at the federal level. Congress is finally taking action on 340B rights.
Well, after years of pretty much ignoring it, there are finally a few 340B-related bills making their way through Congress.
A congressional showdown? This is getting good.
It is, but it's still early in the process, so who knows what will actually happen.
Well, let's break it down. What are the main bills we should be watching?
One of the big ones is the 340B Patients Act. It's a real favorite among covered entities.
Why is that? What makes this bill so special?
Well, it would create a national standard for contract pharmacy access. So it would basically override all those manufacturer restrictions we talked about earlier.
Interesting.
It would protect covered entities and their patients by making sure those 340B discounts are available, no matter where a prescription is filled.
It sounds like a great bill. So what's the holdup? Why isn't it law already?
The biggest problem is that it doesn't have any support from Republicans.
Of course. Politics always gets in the way.
It does, but the bill does have some powerful champions, Representative Matsui and Senator Welch.
I know them.
Both of them are strong advocates for the safety net, so maybe, just maybe, they can convince some Republicans to get on board.
Fingers crossed. So that's the Patients Act. What about the other bills you mentioned? Any other potential game changers?
There's also the 340B Access Act, but that one's a bit controversial.
Oh, how so?
It has support from some community health centers, but a lot of people think it could actually weaken the 340B program.
Weaken it? How?
It was originally put together by a group of community health centers and pharmaceutical companies.
Pharma. That's interesting.
So there's some concern that it might be more beneficial to drug manufacturers than to covered entities.
That does raise some eyebrows.
It does.
So what's the latest on that bill?
Well, it actually just lost its main champion in Congress. Representative Larry Bucshon retired.
Oh, wow.
So now it's kind of up in the air. Will it lose momentum? Or will Representative Buddy Carter and Senator Cassidy pick up the torch?
They both chair important healthcare committees, right?
They do, so their support could be really significant.
Okay, so we've got the Patients Act, the Access Act, and then there's that wild card you mentioned earlier, the 340B Sustain Act. What's the deal with that one?
Well, the Sustain Act tries to take a more balanced approach. It aims to address several key issues all at once. Contract pharmacies, duplicate discounts, and that whole debate about the patient definition.
Oh, yeah, the patient definition. That's been a big headache for covered entities.
It has. HRSA has been using this really narrow definition that dates back to 1996.
Since 1996.
And it just doesn't reflect how healthcare works today.
No. It causes all sorts of compliance problems for covered entities.
It does. So the Sustain Act would update the definition and hopefully provide some much-needed clarity.
Sounds like a good idea.
It does.
So what are the chances of this bill actually becoming law?
It's hard to say, but it does have one big advantage. It's bipartisan.
Bipartisan.
Senators Manchin and Capito are the ones behind it.
I know them.
And they have a good track record of working together.
That's good.
So it's possible. But we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, so we've got 3 major bills in play, each with its own set of pros and cons.
It's definitely a lot to keep track of.
It really is. It's amazing to me how 340B, a program that's supposed to be about helping safety net providers and their patients, has become such a political and legal battleground.
It's become a real hot-button issue.
It has. But it's important to remember that behind all the legal jargon and political maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are being impacted by these decisions.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier some shadowy forces working to undermine 340B at the state level.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
There's this dark money group called Building America's Future. And they've been spending a ton of money trying to kill those state-level contract pharmacy bills we talked about.
That's awful.
It is. They're running these really misleading ads
Yeah.
designed to scare lawmakers and the public. They're trying to link 340B to all sorts of hot-button issues.
Like what?
Oh, things like illegal immigration, abortion,
Yeah.
even gender-affirming care.
They're really trying to exploit people's fears.
They are.
Yeah.
They want to turn people against 340B by associating it with these controversial topics.
Wow. Do you think it's working?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's a dangerous tactic. We need to be really vigilant about pushing back against this misinformation.
Absolutely. We can't let them win.
We can't, thankfully. A lot of state lawmakers seem to be seeing through these scare tactics.
Wow.
They're focused on the real issues, and they recognize how important 340B is for their communities.
Good.
But we can't let our guard down.
No, we can't. Speaking of vigilance, let's talk about HRSA audits. I know it's not the most fun topic, but it's something covered entities need to be aware of.
It is.
And despite all the legal challenges to their authority, HRSA is still auditing covered entities.
They are.
And they're still using their old rules and guidance, even though everything is so uncertain right now.
It creates a lot of confusion and anxiety for covered entities.
It does. I mean,
Yeah.
they're trying to navigate this constantly shifting landscape without any clear direction.
And they're facing potential penalties for interpretations of the rules that are constantly changing.
That's a tough situation.
It is.
We'll dive deeper into all of this and talk about what covered entities can do to protect themselves in the next segment. Yeah, it's a lot for covered entities to handle right now. Between the lawsuits and the legislation and the audits, it's enough to make anyone feel overwhelmed.
It's definitely challenging, but I think what's really amazing is how resilient covered entities have been. They're so committed to serving these vulnerable populations, and they're finding ways to adapt and thrive, despite all these obstacles.
So how are they fighting back? What are some of the strategies our listeners should be aware of?
Well, we're seeing a lot of covered entities getting really involved in those state-level efforts we talked about earlier. They're working with lawmakers, educating the public about the true value of 340B, and pushing back against those misleading ad campaigns.
So it's kind of like a grassroots movement.
Exactly. There's this real sense of community among 340B covered entities. They're sharing information and resources and best practices, supporting each other through all of this.
It's inspiring to see that they're not giving up.
They know how important 340B is for providing affordable medications to millions of people, and they're determined to protect it.
And speaking of protecting the program, we should mention Aventi Health. They really understand the challenges covered entities are facing, and they're dedicated to helping them navigate these tough times.
Absolutely. Aventi Health takes a customer-first approach to 340B third-party administration. They're a great resource for covered entities who need expert guidance and support.
So to kind of recap where we are, we've talked about rebate schemes, contract pharmacy battles, victories in the states, congressional showdowns, even some shady political tactics. It's a lot.
It is a lot to keep track of.
So what does all this mean for the future of 340B?
I think we're at a really critical point. The program is facing some serious threats, but there's also this growing wave of support from covered entities, from patients, and even from some policymakers. People are recognizing how vital 340B is to the healthcare safety net.
It really feels like a tug of war, with the future of 340B hanging in the balance.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The outcomes of these legal battles, what happens with those federal bills, whether those state-level protections hold up, all of that will determine the future of the program.
So what can our listeners do? How can they get involved and help make a difference?
The first thing is to stay informed. Follow organizations like 340B Health, read publications like 340B Report, and of course, keep listening to podcasts like this one.
Knowledge is power.
Right, exactly. The more you know, the better equipped you'll be to advocate for the program.
Go educate yourself.
And then share that information with others. Talk to your friends and family and colleagues. Explain why 340B matters. The more people understand the program and the challenges it's facing, the stronger the base of support will be.
It's about raising awareness and building a collective voice.
Right. And don't forget about your elected officials. Contact them. Let them know that you support 340B and urge them to protect it.
Make your voice heard.
Every voice matters, whether it's supporting those state-level contract pharmacy bills or advocating for federal legislation that strengthens 340B, you can make a difference.
If you're involved with a covered entity, compliance is more important than ever.
Oh, absolutely. With all this scrutiny, you need to be extra careful.
What are some things covered entities should be doing?
Review your policies and procedures, make sure you're documenting everything, and don't be afraid to reach out for expert guidance if you need it.
Aventi Health can be a great resource for that.
They can. They're experts in this area.
Yeah.
Staying compliant is essential. It protects your organization, and it ensures that you can continue to provide affordable care to your patients.
So far, we've focused a lot on the external threats to 340B. The lawsuits, the legislation, the misinformation campaigns. But there are internal challenges too, right?
Oh, definitely.
I'm thinking about the pressure on covered entities to do more with less, to stretch those 340B savings further, to meet the growing needs of their communities.
It's a huge challenge. The demand for safety net services keeps increasing, but funding is often stagnant or even declining. So covered entities are really feeling the squeeze.
They are. So how can they balance compliance with maximizing their impact? How can they make sure they're using those 340B savings in the most strategic and meaningful way?
That's the question, isn't it? I think it starts with remembering the core purpose of 340B. It's not just about generating revenue, it's about investing those savings in ways that directly benefit patients and communities.
It's about using 340B to expand access to care, improve health outcomes, and address those social determinants of health that contribute to health disparities.
Exactly. It's about taking a holistic approach and using 340B as a catalyst for creating a more equitable healthcare system.
It's a reminder that 340B is more than just a program. It's a lifeline for millions of people.
It is. And it's a program worth fighting for.
And it is a fight. It takes a lot of vigilance, a lot of adaptability.
Yeah.
And you really got to be ready to challenge the status quo.
Yeah. I mean, it's not easy. But to everyone out there working in healthcare, we really appreciate your dedication. Keep advocating, keep finding new ways to do things, and most importantly, keep putting your patients first.
Yeah, you guys are the real heroes. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many organizations out there dedicated to supporting 340B, like 340B Health and Aventi Health. They can help you navigate the complexities of the program and make sure you're getting the most out of it.
They're great resources.
So, we've covered a lot today. Rebates, contract pharmacies, state laws, federal bills, even some not-so-great political tactics.
It's a lot to digest.
It is. So what's the takeaway? What does all this mean for the future of 340B?
Well, I think it's safe to say we're at a crossroads.
Crossroads.
The program is facing some pretty serious challenges, but there's also a lot of support out there. From covered entities, patients, policymakers, people are starting to realize how important 340B is for the healthcare safety net, for vulnerable communities.
And the future of the program really depends on what happens next.
It does. The outcome of those lawsuits, the fate of those bills in Congress, how effective those state-level protections are, all of that will determine the future of 340B.
So it's more important than ever for people to get involved.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners out there, what can they do to help?
Stay informed. Stay engaged. Make your voice heard.
Yeah, speak up.
Support organizations like 340B Health. Reach out to your elected officials. Let them know that 340B matters.
And if you're part of a covered entity, make sure you're staying compliant.
Compliance is so crucial right now.
It is.
With all the scrutiny on 340B, you need to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's.
Don't be afraid to reach out for help if you need it. There are resources available.
There are.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up.
I think so too.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into 340B. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Yeah, it's been great talking about this.
It has. And to all our listeners out there, keep up the great work. You're making a real difference in the lives of your patients.
You are.
And we'll be back next week with more 340B news and analysis. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.